They never built an empire. They never crowned a single king over all their lands. And yet, for nearly 1,000 years, Celtic-speaking peoples dominated more of Europe than Rome ever would. From Anatolia to the Atlantic, from the Po Valley to the Scottish Highlands, theirs was a civilization written not in stone edicts, but in twisted gold, in the spirals of sacred metalwork, in the memories of druids who trained for 20 years to carry the knowledge of their world entirely within the mind. They sacked Rome, they raided Delphi, they terrified the Mediterranean. And then, slowly, relentlessly, they were pushed to the very edges of the continent, where they refused to disappear. This is their complete story. It begins in the Bronze Age, among cremation cemeteries and lake dwellings of Central Europe, where the earliest roots of Celtic identity take shape. It follows the rise of salt lords and iron kings in the Alpine highlands, the explosion of Tène art and warfare across the continent, and the building of vast fortified towns that rivaled anything in the ancient world. It traces the Roman hammer that shattered Gaul, the survival of Celtic life in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany, the astonishing monastic flowering that preserved Western learning through the darkest centuries, and the long modern struggle to keep ancient languages alive on the tongues of the living. 6 Celtic languages are still spoken today. Nations still define themselves through this inheritance. The story of the Celts is not finished. It is still being written in classrooms, in parliaments, in songs carried across the Atlantic wind. If you enjoy complete journeys through civilizations that shaped the world, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Let us begin where the story begins, in the fire and bronze of a world before the name. The smoke rises thin and pale over the upper Danube basin. It curls from dozens of low fires burning in shallow pits dug into the dark earth, where the dead are given not to the ground but to flame. The year is somewhere around 1300 before the Common Era, and across a vast sweep of Central Europe, from the middle reaches of Hungary westward through the Alpine forelands and into eastern France, communities are transforming how they honor the departed. The bones, once consumed by fire, are gathered into ceramic urns and placed into flat cemeteries that stretch across open fields. Hundreds of vessels stand in ordered rows beneath the soil, each one holding the calcined remains of a single life. Archaeologists will name this practice, and the civilization behind it, Urnfield. The landscape is one of river valleys and forested uplands, of lakes fed by glacial melt and broad floodplains where cattle graze on summer grass. Along the shores of alpine lakes in what is now Switzerland and southern Bavaria, settlements rise on timber platforms driven into shallow water. These lake dwellings, their oak pilings preserved for millennia in waterlogged sediment, shelter families who fish, farm emmer wheat and barley, and tend small herds of pigs and sheep. The houses are modest, rectangular, built of split planks and thatched with reed, but the objects found within them tell a story of remarkable technical skill and far-reaching connection. Bronze is the defining material of this age. In workshop areas set apart from living quarters, smiths melt copper and tin in clay crucibles over charcoal fires, pouring molten metal into stone and clay molds to produce swords, spearheads, axes, pins, and ornaments. The alloys are carefully controlled. The forms are standardized across enormous distances. A sword type cast in the Carpathian Basin appears nearly identical to one found in the Rhone Valley, evidence of shared technical knowledge transmitted along trade routes that span the continent. Bronze hoards, collections of weapons, tools, and ingots deliberately buried in the earth or deposited in rivers and bogs, appear by the hundreds across Urnfield territory. Whether these represent votive offerings to unseen powers, stores of wealth hidden in times of danger, or some convergence of both, they reveal a society in which metal carries profound material and spiritual value. The rivers themselves are arteries of exchange. The Danube, the Rhine, the Rhone, the Seine, these waterways carry not only goods, but ideas, techniques, and linguistic patterns. Hydronyms, the ancient names of rivers, preserve traces of a language family that linguists identify as Proto-Celtic. Names like Danuvius, Rhenus, and dozens of smaller tributaries carry word roots that will persist into historically attested Celtic tongues, suggesting that the people of the Urnfield world already speak an early form of what will become the Celtic language group. Beyond the continental interior, another network pulses along the Atlantic seaboard. From the tin-rich coasts of Cornwall and Brittany to the gold-bearing rivers of Ireland and the copper sources of southern Iberia, maritime communities trade by skin boat and plank-built vessel along thousands of kilometers of open coastline. Irish gold lunulae appear in Brittany. Iberian bronze types surface in Britain. Atlantic rock art shares motifs across vast distances. This Atlantic Bronze Age world operates largely independent of Mediterranean influence, yet it overlaps and intertwines with the Urnfield sphere at key points, in Brittany, in the Loire Valley, along the Channel coasts. By around 800 before the Common Era, the Urnfield tradition is shifting. Cremation cemeteries grow larger and more elaborate. Some burials contain bronze vessels of exceptional quality, horse gear, and weapons that suggest emerging social hierarchies. In the Eastern Alps, communities controlling access to salt deposits, that most precious of preservatives, begin accumulating extraordinary wealth. The flat cemeteries give way to tumulus burials. Hilltop settlements acquire timber ramparts. A new cultural phase is crystallizing, one that will carry the name of a small lakeside village in the Austrian Alps. But for now, in the last centuries of the Urnfield world, the foundations are already laid, in metal, in language, in the rivers that carry memory forward through time. The village sits at the edge of a still alpine lake, hemmed by mountains whose slopes hold a secret older than memory. Deep inside the rock above Hallstatt, veins of salt run through the limestone like frozen rivers, white, crystalline, and immensely valuable. By the 8th century before the Common Era, the communities here have learned to follow these veins into the mountain itself, cutting shafts and galleries with bronze picks, hauling raw salt to the surface in leather backpacks worn smooth by generations of use. The tunnels are narrow, lit by pine-wood torches whose resinous smoke blackens the ceilings. Preserved within the salt, which arrests decay with extraordinary precision, are fragments of the miner's world. Broken tool handles, scraps of woven textile, leather caps, even traces of food. The mountain becomes both workplace and archive. Salt transforms everything it touches. It preserves meat and fish for months, making long-distance trade in perishable goods possible for the first time. It becomes currency in all but name. The communities controlling Hallstatt's mines and the nearby deposits at the Durnberg above Hallein grow wealthy beyond anything the Urnfield world produced. Their dead tell the story. Over 1,000 graves cluster in the cemetery above the lake, spanning roughly 4 centuries. The earliest contain bronze swords and simple pottery. But as the generations pass, the burials grow richer. Iron daggers appear alongside bronze, then replace it entirely. Gold ornaments, amber beads from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, glass from the Mediterranean. The grave goods map a trade network of staggering reach. Iron is the second revolution. Harder than bronze, more abundant in ore, it demands different skills, higher furnace temperatures, repeated hammering and folding. By the 7th century before the Common Era, Hallstatt smiths master the new metal. Iron plowshares break heavier soils. Iron axes clear forests faster. Iron swords hold sharper edges. The shift from bronze to iron reshapes agriculture, warfare, and social power simultaneously. Those who control iron production and salt extraction command surplus wealth sufficient to sustain a new kind of elite, not merely prosperous farmers, but princes. Their seats rise on hilltops across the Celtic heartland. The Höneberg, perched above the upper Danube in what is now southwestern Germany, stands as the most remarkable. Around 600 before the Common Era, its rulers demolish the traditional timber and earth rampart and replace a section with a wall of sun-dried mud brick set on limestone foundations, a construction technique borrowed directly from the Greek Mediterranean. It is the northernmost mud brick fortification in all of Europe, evidence of direct contact with Greek colonial cities along the southern French coast, particularly Massalia, founded around 600 before the Common Era. Inside the Höneberg's walls, dense settlement clusters around workshops producing bronze jewelry, textiles, and pottery. Outside, a lower town spreads across the plateau. Population estimates suggest several thousand inhabitants, a proto-urban concentration unprecedented north of the Alps. Far to the west, at Mont-la-Soise in Burgundy, another princely seat commands the headwaters of the Seine. Here, around 500 before the Common Era, a woman of extraordinary status is laid to rest beneath a great tumulus at nearby Vix. Her burial chamber contains the largest bronze vessel ever found in the ancient world, a crater standing over 1.5 meters tall of Greek manufacture, capable of holding over 1,000 liters of wine. Around her neck lies a gold torque of exquisite craftsmanship, its terminals shaped into delicate lion paw forms. The Vix burial reveals a society in which women could hold supreme rank and in which Mediterranean luxury goods served as instruments of political authority. These princely centers do not exist in isolation. They form nodes in a network stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Hungarian plain, connected by rivers, the Danube, the Rhine, the Rhone, the Seine, that serve as highways for trade in salt, tin, amber, wine, and finished metalwork. Etruscan bronze vessels and Greek black figure pottery travel northward. Celtic furs, slaves, salt, and metals flow south. The exchange is not merely economic. Artistic motifs, architectural ideas, and social customs travel with the goods. Hallstatt elites adopt the Greek practice of the symposium. Communal wine drinking, importing not just the wine, but the vessels, the ritual, and the prestige. By the late 6th century before the Common Era, the Hallstatt princely system begins to fracture. The Höneberg is destroyed by fire around 530 before the Common Era. Mont-la-Soise declines. Power shifts northward toward the Middle Rhine and the Marne, where new elites are forging a different kind of culture, lighter, more mobile, more aggressive. The age of the Hallstatt princes is ending, but the foundations they built, in iron, in trade, in the language of aristocratic display, pass forward into the hands of their successors, who will carry the Celtic name across half a continent. The shift comes swiftly. Within a single generation, the centers of Celtic power migrate northward from the Alpine foothills to the rolling country between the Middle Rhine and the Marne. Here, in the damp river valleys of what is now the Champagne region and the Rhineland, a new aristocracy rises, younger, more restless, unburdened by the old Hallstatt hierarchies that crumbled with the burning of the Heuneberg. These elites do not build massive hilltop citadels. They ride. The chariot defines them. Light two-wheeled vehicles with iron-rimmed wheels and yokes for paired ponies appear in graves across the Marne Valley by the early 5th century before the Common Era. At Somme-Bionne, a warrior lies on the bed of his chariot, his weapons arranged beside him, bronze fittings gleaming with a new kind of ornament, not the geometric patterns of Hallstatt, but something fluid, alive, almost breathing. Tendrils of vegetal design curl around the metalwork. Faces emerge half-hidden within spirals. Palmettes borrowed from Greek art dissolve into forms that no Greek craftsman would recognize, transformed into something entirely Celtic. This is the birth of La Tène art, named for a site on the northern shore of Lake Neuchâtel in modern Switzerland, where hundreds of iron swords, spearheads, shields, and tools were deposited in shallow water, a vast votive offering to powers beneath the surface. The La Tène style spreads with extraordinary speed. Bronze fibulae, scabbard plates, and helmet fittings carry the new curvilinear vocabulary from the Rhine to Bohemia, from the Seine basin to the upper Danube. The designs resist symmetry. They play with ambiguity. A leaf becomes a face, a scroll becomes a bird, a tendril becomes a serpent. Coral imported from the Mediterranean is inlaid into bronze. Enamel work in red and white fills recessed panels on horse gear and shield bosses. Every surface becomes a field for transformation. Behind this artistic revolution stands a social one. The warrior aristocracy of the La Tène world organizes itself through bonds of personal loyalty. A chief gathers retainers through feasting, gift-giving, and the distribution of plunder. Druids, the learned priestly class whose oral training spans as many as 20 years, serve as mediators, judges, and keepers of sacred knowledge. Bards memorize genealogies that bind families to ancestors and territory. The social fabric is vertical and personal, not bureaucratic. Power flows through relationships, not institutions. And this society is hungry for land. By roughly 400 before the Common Era, Celtic-speaking groups begin crossing the Alpine passes in force, descending into the broad, fertile plain of the Po River. The Insubres establish themselves around a settlement they call Mediolanum, the future Milan. The Boier settle near modern Bologna, which preserves their name. The Cenomani occupy the area around Brescia and Verona. The Senones push farthest south, reaching the Adriatic coast near modern Ancona. These are not mere raids. Families migrate, settlements take root, fields are ploughed, cemeteries fill with La Tène metalwork alongside Etruscan and Italic goods. The Etruscans, whose civilization has dominated northern Italy for centuries, find themselves pressed from both sides, Romans advancing from the south, Celts descending from the north. Celtic warriors, tall by Mediterranean standards, fighting with long iron slashing swords and large oval shields, prove devastating in open battle. Their reputation for ferocity precedes them. Greek writers describe the Celtic charge, a wall of noise, the deep drone of the Carnick's war trumpet, warriors stripped bare, hair stiffened with lime wash into wild crests. Yet the expansion is not purely military. Trade continues alongside warfare. Celtic metalworkers absorb Etruscan techniques. Wine amphorae appear in Tène settlements north of the Alps in growing quantities. The exchange is reciprocal and transformative. Celtic society in the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era is not a static tribal world, but a dynamic, expansive culture reshaping itself through contact, conflict, and movement. From the Marne to the Po, from Lake Neuchâtel to the Adriatic shore, the spiral of Tène art marks the presence of peoples who are remaking the map of Europe, and who will soon turn their eyes toward Rome itself. The Senones crossed the Apennines in the summer of 390 before the Common Era. They move in loose columns, warriors, families, wagons loaded with provisions and plunder, following river valleys southward through the Italian peninsula toward a city they know only by reputation. Rome is not yet the master of the Mediterranean. It is a regional power, its territory barely extending beyond Latium, its legions untested against the fury that now descends from the north. The confrontation comes on the 11th of July along the banks of the Allia, a small tributary of the Tiber barely 11 miles from Rome's walls. The Roman army deploys in conventional formation, but the Celtic charge shatters it. Warriors surge forward in a wall of sound, the bellowing Carnick's trumpets, the clash of iron on bronze, the war cries of men who fight with a ferocity Romans have never encountered. The Roman right flank collapses first, then the center breaks. Soldiers flee into the Tiber or scatter across the countryside. The road to Rome lies open. 3 days later, the Senones enter the city. Most of the population has fled. The senators who remain, seated in their ivory chairs in the forum, are cut down. The city burns. Only the Capitoline Hill holds out, its garrison sustained by grain stores and the steep rock itself. For 7 months the siege continues. The story of the sacred geese of Juno alerting defenders to a night assault enters Roman memory as foundational trauma. When negotiations finally produce a ransom, 1,000 pounds of gold weighed on Celtic scales, the leader called Brennus reportedly throws his sword onto the balance, adding its weight to the price. Rome pays, and the Senones withdraw northward, laden with treasure. The sack of Rome reverberates through the ancient world. For the Romans, it becomes the defining catastrophe, the wound that reshapes their military doctrine, their wall building, their obsessive fear of northern invasion. The Servian wall rises around the city in the decades that follow, 6 miles of tufa block encircling the 7 hills. But for the Celtic world, Rome is merely one target among many. Throughout the 4th century before the Common Era, Celtic warbands probe southward and eastward with relentless energy. In Italy, the Boii, Lingones, and Senones maintain their hold on the Po Valley, clashing repeatedly with Roman armies. In the east, Celtic peoples push along the Danube corridor into the Balkans. By the early 3rd century, the pressure intensifies. In 281, a Celtic force under Bulgios invades Macedon and kills its king, Ptolemy Keraunos. The following year, a massive expedition under another leader also called Brennus, a title or name recurring across Celtic tradition, drives deep into Greece with an army ancient sources number at over 150,000, though such figures are certainly inflated. The target is Delphi, seat of Apollo's oracle, repository of centuries of votive wealth. In 279 before the Common Era, Celtic forces reach the sanctuary. Greek defenders hold the narrow passes at Thermopylae but are outflanked. The Celts press on to Delphi itself. Ancient accounts describe storms, rockfalls, and divine intervention repelling the attackers. The reality is likely a combination of fierce Greek resistance, harsh winter terrain, and overextended Celtic supply lines. Brennus is wounded. The expedition withdraws, harried by Greek counterattacks, and Brennus dies during the retreat. Yet the eastern Celtic migration does not end at Delphi. 3 tribes, the Trochmi, Tolistobogi, and Tectosages, cross the Hellespont into Anatolia around 278 before the Common Era, invited by Nicomedes of Bithynia as mercenaries. They carve out a territory in the central Anatolian plateau that becomes known as Galatia, with its capital eventually fixed at Ancyra. For generations, these Galatians maintain their Celtic language, their tribal assemblies, and their warrior customs in the heart of the Hellenistic world, a Celtic island surrounded by Greek-speaking kingdoms. From the Tiber to the Bosporus, from the Po to the Anatolian steppe, Celtic arms have reached their farthest extent. Greek and Roman writers respond with a literary construction that will endure for millennia, the image of the wild, fearless, undisciplined barbarian, magnificent in courage but incapable of sustained order. Polybius describes them fighting naked. Diodorus records the taking of enemy heads as trophies, preserved in cedar oil. The carnix, with its bronze boar-headed bell raised above the battlefield, becomes a symbol of terror in Mediterranean art. These accounts are not fabrications, but they are selective, designed to frame Celtic peoples as the antithesis of civilized order. The reality is far more complex, a world of skilled metallurgy, sophisticated art, and political structures that will soon produce something Rome itself will struggle to overcome. That complexity now takes physical form. By the middle of the 3rd century before the Common Era, the Celtic world is no longer a scattering of hill forts and aristocratic farmsteads. It is building cities. They are called oppida, a Latin term later applied by Roman observers, but the structures themselves are unmistakably Celtic in conception and execution. Across a vast arc from southern Britain through Gaul, the Rhineland, and deep into the Danube basin, fortified settlements of extraordinary scale rise on plateaus, river bends, and commanding hilltops. These are not mere refuges. They are centers of production, governance, trade, and identity, the closest thing the Celtic world produces to an urban civilization. Manching, in what is now Bavaria, sprawls across 380 hectares of flat ground near the Danube. A massive rampart encircles the settlement, stretching more than 7 kilometers. Inside, thousands of people live and work in timber-framed houses arranged along planned streets. Iron smelting furnaces glow in dedicated quarters. Glass workshops produce beads of vivid blue and yellow, traded across hundreds of kilometers. Coin dies stamp gold and silver blanks. Animal bone accumulates in butchery zones that suggest organized food distribution. This is not a village that grew large. It is a planned community, built with intention. Farther west, Bibracte crowns Mont-Beuvray in central Gaul, the capital of the Aedui. Its ramparts employ a technique so distinctive that Caesar himself describes it in detail, the Murus Gallicus. Horizontal timbers are laid in alternating courses, pinned together with long iron nails, the gaps filled with rubble and faced with stone. The result is a wall that absorbs the impact of battering rams, resists fire, and stands with a solidity that impresses even Roman military engineers. At Bebracht, metalworkers produce enameled bronze fibulae of astonishing precision. Potters shape vessels on fast wheels. The smell of charcoal and hot metal hangs in the air of artisan quarters, where families pass specialized skills through generations. Zavist, south of modern Prague, commands the Vltava Valley from a fortified acropolis. Entremont, near Aix-en-Provence, serves as the capital of the Salian, its stone walls enclosing sanctuaries where carved stone pillars display severed heads, not trophies of barbarism, but sacred representations of ancestral power and cosmic order. Celtic coinage tells its own story of transformation. The earliest Celtic coins imitate the gold status of Philip II of Macedon, carried home by Celtic mercenaries who served in Mediterranean armies. But within decades, Celtic minters radically abstract the original designs. The laureate head of Apollo dissolves into swirling curves. The chariot on the reverse becomes a single wheel, a horse reduced to flowing lines. These are not failed copies. They are deliberate artistic reimaginings, expressing a Celtic aesthetic that privileges movement and metamorphosis over static representation. Governance in the Oppida reflects a society more structured than Mediterranean writers acknowledge. Among the Iadwi, a magistrate called the Vagobret holds supreme executive authority for a single year, elected by a council of nobles. Laws prohibit any family from holding the office in consecutive generations. Seasonal assemblies gather free men to deliberate on matters of war, alliance, and justice. Druids arbitrate disputes and enforce decisions with the threat of exclusion from sacrifice, a social death more feared than physical punishment. Client relationships bind lesser nobles to greater ones through obligations of service, gift exchange, and mutual defense. Trade networks pulse through the Oppida like blood through arteries. Mediterranean wine amphorae arrive in staggering quantities. At Bebracht and Toulouse, archaeological deposits suggest consumption on a scale that implies wine has become integral to elite feasting and political ritual. In return, Celtic traders export grain, cattle, hides, iron tools, woolen textiles, and enslaved captives southward. The rivers, the Rhône, the Loire, the Rhine, the Danube, serve as highways connecting the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, the North Sea to the Alps. By the late 2nd century before the Common Era, the largest Oppida house populations of 10,000 or more. They mint their own coins, maintain specialized craft quarters, and project political authority over surrounding territories. The Celtic world has achieved something remarkable, a decentralized urban civilization, without a single capital or emperor, held together by shared language, art, religion, and networks of obligation. Yet this very decentralization, this refusal of centralized command, leaves each oppidum, each tribe, each confederation to face alone what is coming from the south. Beyond the ramparts and the minting halls, beyond the forges and the feasting benches, there exists another architecture, invisible, carried entirely in memory, transmitted across generations through the spoken word alone. The Celtic world builds its deepest structures not in stone or timber, but in the trained minds of its learned orders, and it is these orders that hold the civilization together at a level no oppidum wall can reach. The druids stand at the summit. Classical observers, Caesar, Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, Pomponius Mela, describe them with a mixture of fascination and unease. They are priests, certainly, presiding over sacrifice and ritual, but they are also judges who arbitrate disputes between tribes, philosophers who teach the immortality of the soul, and astronomers who track the movements of stars and the turning of seasons. Caesar, writing in the 50s before the Common Era, reports that druidic training lasts as long as 20 years, conducted entirely through oral transmission. Nothing of their sacred knowledge is committed to writing, though the Celts use Greek letters for ordinary business. The prohibition is deliberate. Knowledge held in memory belongs to the living mind. Written down, it becomes inert, available to the uninitiated. Their authority crosses tribal boundaries. Druids gather annually at a sacred place in the territory of the Canutes, regarded as the center of all Gaul, to settle legal disputes and render judgments that carry weight across confederations. A druid's pronouncement can halt armies. Exclusion from sacrifice, a form of excommunication, strips a person of all social standing, leaving them untouchable. Caesar notes that many young men of noble birth seek druidic training voluntarily, drawn by the exemption from military service and taxation that the order enjoys. Beside the druids stand two other learned classes. The Vates, seers and diviners, interpret omens, read the flight of birds, examine the entrails of sacrificed animals, and practice forms of prophecy that Strabo compares to augury. The bards compose praise poetry and satire, wielding words as weapons. A bard's satire can destroy a chieftain's reputation. A bard's praise can immortalize a lineage. Together, these three orders form the intellectual infrastructure of Celtic society, a priesthood of knowledge that binds the scattered tribes into a shared mental world. The sacred spaces where this knowledge finds expression are not temples of cut stone. They are nemetons, sacred groves set apart from cultivation, where ancient oaks or other trees form living canopies over ritual ground. Lucan describes a grove near Massalia so dense and dark that priests themselves fear to enter at midday. At Rocapertus in southern Gaul, a stone portico holds human skulls set into carved niches, the heads of honored dead or defeated enemies displayed at the threshold between worlds. The Celts regard the head as the seat of the soul, and the taking and preserving of heads carries profound ritual meaning. Water, too, serves as a gateway. Rivers, lakes, springs, and bogs receive extraordinary votive deposits, swords deliberately bent or broken, shields, spears, jewelry, cauldrons, and sometimes human bodies. The great silver Gundestrup cauldron, found in a Danish bog but bearing unmistakably Celtic iconography, depicts antlered deities, warriors, ritual processions, and a figure plunging men headfirst into a vessel, possibly a scene of sacrifice or resurrection. Lindoman, recovered from a Cheshire peat bog and dated to the 1st century of the Common Era, bears evidence of a threefold death: bludgeoned, garroted, and throat cut, then placed face down in the dark water. Whether criminal, captive, or willing offering, his body testifies to a cosmology in which the boundary between life and death is permeable, negotiable, and sacred. Time itself is structured by this cosmology. The Coligny calendar, a fragmented bronze tablet discovered in eastern France, and dated to the 2nd century of the Common Era, reveals a sophisticated lunisolar system. It tracks months of 29 and 30 days, marks certain days as auspicious or inauspicious, and intercalates additional months to align lunar and solar cycles over a 5-year span. The calendar demonstrates mathematical precision preserved entirely within the Druidic tradition, astronomical knowledge encoded not in monumental observatories, but in the disciplined memory of specialists. This is the mind of the Celtic world, decentralized, oral, ritualized, and profoundly attuned to thresholds, between tribes, between seasons, between the living and the dead. It requires no single scripture, no central temple, no written canon. It lives in the voices of those trained to carry it. And when those voices fall silent, when conquest, conversion, or cultural erasure interrupts the chain of transmission, the knowledge does not survive in archives. It simply vanishes, leaving only the bent swords in riverbeds, the skulls in stone niches, and the bronze fragments of a calendar no one can fully read. The silence of the Druids is answered by the noise of legions. In the spring of 58 before the Common Era, the Helvetii, a Celtic people hemmed into the Swiss plateau by Germanic pressure from the north, set fire to their 12 oppida and 400 villages and begin moving west. 368,000 men, women, and children, according to census tablets later found in their abandoned camps, stream toward the passes of the Jura, seeking new lands in southwestern Gaul. It is a migration born of desperation. It becomes the pretext for annihilation. Gaius Julius Caesar, newly appointed governor of Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum, marches north with 6 legions. He is 41 years old, deeply indebted, politically ambitious, and in need of a war that will generate the wealth and military glory to rival Pompey. The Helvetii provide it. Caesar destroys the bridge at Geneva, blocks the Rhone crossing, and pursues the migrating column across the Saône. At Bibracte, in June, his legions smash the Helvetii in a battle lasting from midday until nightfall. The survivors, barely a third of those who set out, are ordered to return to their burned homeland. This is not a border action. It is the opening movement of an 8-year campaign that will consume all of Gaul. Caesar's method is systematic. He identifies tribal rivalries, exploits them, and intervenes as an ally before transforming alliance into subjugation. The Aedui invite him against the Germanic king Ariovistus. Caesar defeats Ariovistus and remains. The following year, 57 before the Common Era, he turns north against the Belgi, the fiercest of the Gallic peoples by his own account. The Nervi ambush his column at the Sabis River, nearly overwhelming 2 legions before Roman discipline and reinforcements reverse the battle. The Belgi are broken tribe by tribe. Each campaigning season extends the conquest. 56. The Veneti of Armorica, masters of Atlantic seamanship, are defeated when Roman ships cut their leather sails with hooks mounted on long poles. Caesar orders the entire Venetic Senate executed and the population sold into slavery. 55. He bridges the Rhine in 10 days, a feat of military engineering meant to terrify Germanic peoples, then crosses to Britain twice, in 55 and 54, reconnaissance expeditions that establish no permanent hold, but demonstrate limitless Roman reach. The Oppida burn. Avaricum falls in 52 after a siege in freezing rain. Caesar's soldiers massacre the entire population of 40,000. The Murus Gallicus walls, those ingenious timber and iron constructions that had defined Celtic urban power, prove inadequate against Roman siege ramps, artillery towers, and the relentless patience of professional soldiers who dig rather than charge. Yet Gaul does not submit quietly. In the winter of 53 to 52, rebellion erupts under Vercingetorix, a young Arvernian nobleman who achieves what no Celtic leader has managed before: genuine coordination among dozens of tribes. He adopts a scorched earth strategy, denying Roman foragers grain and fodder, burning Gallic towns to starve the legions. At Gergovia, in the spring of 52, Vercingetorix inflicts a rare defeat on Caesar, killing 700 legionaries and forcing a withdrawal. It is the high water mark of resistance. Caesar regroups, defeats the Gallic cavalry in open country using Germanic horsemen, and drives Vercingetorix into the hilltop fortress of Alesia with 80,000 warriors. What follows is the masterpiece of Roman siege warfare. Caesar constructs an inner circumvallation 18 kilometers long facing the fortress, then an outer contravallation 21 kilometers long facing outward against the relief army. Between the lines, trenches, sharpened stakes called lilies concealed in pits, iron barbs called stimuli buried in the ground. When the Gallic relief force, numbering perhaps 250,000, arrives and attacks from outside, while Vercingetorix sorties from within, the double line holds. The relief army breaks, Vercingetorix surrenders. He is kept in a Roman dungeon for 6 years, paraded through Caesar's triumph in 46 before the Common Era, then strangled in the Tullianum prison. Caesar's own account claims 1 million Gauls killed and another million enslaved across the 8 years of war. Even allowing for exaggeration, the demographic catastrophe is staggering. The political structures of independent Gaul, the assemblies, the Vergobrets, the tribal confederacies, are dismantled. The druids, guardians of law and memory, lose their institutional authority. The oppida are abandoned or rebuilt as Roman towns. Latin begins its slow replacement of Gaulish speech. A civilization that had flourished for 5 centuries across the breadth of Europe is, on the continent, effectively ended. But the island across the Channel has not yet fallen. Even as Gaul burns, Britain remains a world apart, separated by 20 miles of grey water, governed by its own tribal kings, defended by its own warrior aristocracies. Caesar himself had tested those shores. In the late summer of 55, before the Common Era, he crossed with 2 legions, landing on the shingle beaches near modern Deal. The expedition was a reconnaissance, not a conquest. British charioteers harassed the Roman beachhead, storms damaged the fleet, and Caesar withdrew after barely 3 weeks. He returned the following summer with 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry, pushing inland across the Thames, compelling the Catuvellauni king Cassivellaunus to submit and pay tribute. Then he left again, and for nearly a century, Rome's attention turned elsewhere. Britain in those intervening decades is no backwater. The tribal kingdoms consolidate and compete. The Catuvellauni, based at their capital Camulodunum in modern Essex, expand aggressively under Cunobelinus, whom Roman writers call the King of the Britons. His gold status circulate widely. The Atrebates in the south maintain diplomatic ties with Rome. The Iceni in East Anglia, the Brigantes across the northern uplands, the Silures and Ordovices in Wales, each commands territory, raises warriors, mints coins, and trades across the Channel. Hill forts like Maiden Castle in Dorset, with its massive concentric ramparts and sling-stone arsenals, stand as monuments to generations of defensive engineering. The invasion, when it finally comes, arrives in the spring of 43 of the Common Era. Emperor Claudius, needing military prestige, dispatches 4 legions and auxiliary forces, perhaps 40,000 men, under the command of Aulus Plautius. They cross the Channel, defeat a British coalition at the Medway, and push to the Thames. Claudius himself arrives with war elephants for the ceremonial capture of Camulodunum. A legionary fortress rises where a Celtic capital once stood. A temple to the deified Claudius is erected, a deliberate symbol of subjugation. Some tribes submit. The Iceni under King Prasutagus accept client status. The Regni and Sussex collaborate. Others resist with ferocity. The Silures wage guerrilla warfare in the Welsh hills for years. Caratacus, son of Cunobelinus, leads resistance across southern and western Britain before his final defeat and capture in 51 of the Common Era. He is paraded through Rome but spared, a curiosity, not a threat. The breaking point comes in 60 of the Common Era. Prasutagus dies, leaving his kingdom jointly to his daughters and the emperor. Roman officials ignore the will. They seize Iceni lands, flog Queen Boudica, and assault her daughters. The Iceni rise, the Trinovantes join them. Boudica leads a host that descends on Camulodunum, where the hated temple of Claudius becomes a last refuge for Roman settlers before the entire town is burned to ash. A destruction layer of reddened earth still marks this moment in the archaeological record. Londinium falls next, then Verulamium. Tacitus records 70,000 to 80,000 killed across the 3 cities. Roman citizens, veterans, merchants, and allied Britons alike. The governor Suetonius Paulinus, returning from his campaign against the druids on Anglesey, gathers his forces and meets Boudica's army at a site still debated. Roman discipline prevails against overwhelming numbers. The rebellion collapses. Boudica dies, by poison, according to Tacitus. Rome tightens its grip. Over the following 2 decades, legions push into Wales, northern England, and finally Scotland. Gnaeus Julius Agricola, governor from 77 to 84 of the Common Era, campaigns systematically northward. At Mons Graupius in 84, he defeats a Caledonian confederation. Tacitus, Agricola's son-in-law, places a speech in the mouth of the Caledonian leader Calgacus, words that indict empire itself. Whether Calgacus spoke them matters less than what they reveal. Rome understood that its conquest came at a cost measured not only in blood, but in the extinction of free societies. Yet Scotland is never fully held. Agricola is recalled. His forts are abandoned. The frontier will eventually crystallize at Hadrian's Wall, begun in 122 of the Common Era, a line of stone and turf stretching 80 Roman miles from coast to coast, marking the boundary between the Roman province of Britannia and the unconquered Celtic north. Beyond that wall, in the highlands and islands, in Ireland untouched by any legion, Celtic life continues on its own terms. Beyond that wall, Celtic life does not merely persist. It transforms, adapts, and in one great island to the west, flourishes entirely beyond Rome's reach. The 2nd century of the Common Era opens across 2 divergent worlds sharing a common ancestry. In Gaul, the transformation is nearly complete. Cities like Augustodunum, built over the old Aeduan heartland, rise in limestone and tile. Temples stand where sacred groves once whispered. but they are hybrid structures, Celtic deities wearing Roman names. Sulis merged with Minerva at Aquae Sulis, Lugus honored under the guise of Mercury. Gallo-Roman aristocrats commission mosaic floors depicting Celtic hunting scenes framed by classical borders. The language of administration, law, and commerce is Latin. Gaulish speech retreats to the countryside, to the lips of farmers and herdsmen, fading across generations until by the 4th century it survives only in scattered phrases and personal names embedded in Latin texts. In Roman Britain, a similar fusion unfolds. Villas with underfloor heating dot the lowland countryside. Towns like Londinium, Verulamium, and Corinium grow prosperous. Yet Celtic undercurrents run deep. Rural shrines maintain pre-Roman forms. Curse tablets scratched in Latin invoke Celtic gods. The Brigantian north remains only thinly Romanized, its population clinging to older patterns of pastoral life and hilltop settlement. But it is Ireland that stands apart entirely. No Roman road crosses its boglands. No legionary fortress commands its river crossings. Across the Irish Sea, a society of perhaps 500,000 people thrives in a landscape dotted with over 45,000 ring forts, circular earthen enclosures called raths, each sheltering a farmstead of timber and wattle. Larger examples, the multivallet forts with 2 or 3 concentric banks, mark the residences of local kings and chieftains. Cattle are the primary measure of wealth. Herds move between summer and winter pastures in a pattern of transhumance that shapes the rhythm of the year. The great royal sites anchor this world in ceremony and myth. The hill of Tara in the Meath Midlands rises gently above the surrounding plain, its earthworks ancient even by this period, its significance as the seat of sacral kingship already centuries old. Emain Macha in the north, the capital of the Ulayad, carries associations with the heroes of oral tradition that bards recite at feasts. Cruachan in Connaught serves the western kingdoms. These are not administrative capitals in any Roman sense. They are places of inauguration, assembly, and ritual, where kingship is conferred through ceremony, where the relationship between ruler and land is understood as sacred. Irish society organizes itself through an intricate web of kinship, clientship, and obligation. The Tuath, a petty kingdom numbering perhaps 3,000 people, forms the basic political unit. Over 150 Tuatha exist simultaneously, grouped under provincial overkings who themselves acknowledge, in theory, a high king. The learned orders persist here as nowhere else. Druids transition gradually toward new roles as Christianity approaches. But the Philid, the poet-seers, maintain their status, their memorized genealogies stretching back through generations of kings. North of Hadrian's Wall, another Celtic world endures. The Picts, their name a Roman label meaning the painted ones, occupy the lands from the Forth northward to the Orkney Islands. Their society leaves enigmatic traces. Symbol stones carved with crescents, double discs, serpents, and mirror and comb motifs whose precise meaning remains debated. Pictish metalwork shows Tène inheritance filtered through centuries of independent development. Their kingdoms will prove resilient enough to resist both Roman incursion and later Anglo-Saxon expansion. By the late 4th century, as Roman power fractures under civil wars and barbarian pressure, the edges of empire become permeable. Irish raiders, later called Scoti, strike the western coasts of Britain. Pictish war bands probe south of the wall. In 367, a coordinated assault by Picts, Scots, and Atticotti overwhelms Roman frontier defences in what later historians call the Great Conspiracy. Rome restores order, but the pattern is set. The periphery is pressing inward. Meanwhile, in Ireland, a new script emerges. Ogham, a system of notches and lines carved along the edges of standing stones, appears in the southern provinces around the 4th century. Its alphabet derives from knowledge of Latin letters, yet its form is entirely original, adapted to the medium of stone and wood. These inscriptions mark boundaries, commemorate the dead, and assert lineage in a language unmistakably Irish. They are the first written words of a Celtic tongue composed by Celtic hands, a quiet revolution carved in stone while Rome's continental order begins its long unravelling. Rome withdraws its legions from Britain in 410 of the Common Era, and the stone fortresses, the heated bathhouses, the paved roads that once carried imperial authority to the edges of the known world fall silent. Rain pools in the courtyards of abandoned villas. Weeds crack through mosaic floors. The administrative machinery that governed millions simply stops. And into this vacuum, something unexpected emerges. Not collapse, but reinvention. Across the Irish Sea, on an island Rome never touched, a former slave returns as a missionary. The man later known as St. Patrick arrives in Ireland around 432, carrying Latin scripture into a world still governed by druids, cattle lords, and the ancient oral traditions of the Philid. He does not arrive with legions, he carries no sword. Yet within 2 generations, Ireland transforms. The old sacred sites do not vanish, they are absorbed. Holy wells once dedicated to Brigid, the goddess, become shrines to Brigid the saint. The monastic enclosure replaces the druidic grove, but the reverence for learning, for memory, for the spoken word, transfers almost seamlessly from one tradition to the next. By the 6th century, Irish monasticism has become something without parallel in Western Christendom. At Clonmacnoise, founded by St. Ciaran around 544 on the banks of the Shannon, monks build a community that will endure for nearly 1,000 years. At Skellig Michael, 8 miles off the Kerry coast, a handful of ascetics construct beehive stone huts on a rock pinnacle 600 feet above the Atlantic, a place so remote it seems designed to bring the human soul to the very threshold between earth and heaven. These are not monasteries in the Roman sense. They are small, intensely communal, governed by abbots rather than bishops, organized around kinship networks and tribal affiliations. The abbot is often related to the local king. The monastery functions as school, scriptorium, hospital, and sanctuary. The manuscripts produced in these cells astonish. The Book of Durrow, created around 680, merges La Tène spiral ornament with Christian iconography. Carpet pages of interlocking knots rendered in pigments of yellow, red, and green on prepared calfskin. Every stroke is deliberate, meditative, a form of prayer expressed through the hand. The tradition will culminate around 800 in the Book of Kells, perhaps the most lavishly decorated manuscript in the Western world. From Ireland, monks carry their learning outward. Columba founds Iona off the Scottish coast around 563, and from that small island, Christianity spreads to the Picts and the Anglo-Saxons. Lindisfarne, established around 634, becomes the cradle of Northumbrian Christian art. The Lindisfarne Gospels, completed around 700, blend insular Celtic design with Anglo-Saxon and Mediterranean influences. Meanwhile, Columbanus departs Ireland around 590, crossing Gaul and founding monasteries at Luxeuil and Annagray before establishing Bobbio in northern Italy in 614. Celtic monks walk back into the continent their ancestors once raided, this time bearing ink and vellum instead of iron swords. In Britain, post-Roman Celtic kingdoms crystallize. Gwynedd in northwest Wales, Dumnonia in the southwest, Strathclyde in the north, and Dal Riata bridging northeastern Ireland and western Scotland. These are small, fragile polities, often warring among themselves, yet culturally vibrant. The Welsh language begins producing its earliest poetry. The Gododin, attributed to the bard Aneirin, commemorates a catastrophic defeat of British warriors by the Angles at Catraeth around 590, a lament for a world already slipping away. The Synod of Whitby in 664 resolves the tension between Celtic and Roman Christian practices, particularly the calculation of Easter. The Roman method prevails, and gradually insular churches align with continental norms. Yet the artistic and intellectual legacy of Celtic monasticism endures. The Ardagh chalice, crafted in the 8th century from silver, bronze, brass, and gold with glass studs, represents metalworking of breathtaking precision, a direct descendant of La Tène craftsmanship now consecrated to Christian liturgy. High crosses at Monaster Bois rise in carved stone, their panels depicting scripture in a visual language accessible to those who cannot read. These crosses stand where Ogham stones once marked boundaries, new monuments on ancient ground, the Celtic world rewriting itself in the grammar of a new faith while preserving the cadence of the old. The fire comes from the sea. In the summer of 795 of the Common Era, Norse longships appear off the coast of Rathlin Island, north of Ireland. The monks there have no walls, no garrison, no warning system adequate to the speed of these shallow drafted vessels. The raiders strike the monastery, seize its metalwork, chalices, reliquaries, book shrines, and vanish back into the grey Atlantic before any local king can muster a response. It is the first recorded Viking raid on Ireland, and it announces a century of devastation that will reshape every Celtic society touched by the Northern Sea. Within a decade, no coastal monastery is safe. Iona, Columba's sacred island, is raided in 795, again in 802, and catastrophically in 806, when 68 monks are killed on the beach in a single assault. The community begins transferring its most precious possessions to Kells, inland in County Meath, where the great Gospel manuscript, the Book of Kells, finds its final home. This masterwork of insular illumination, likely begun on Iona and completed at Kells around 800, survives precisely because monks understood that the coast had become a killing ground. Its pages of interlaced serpents, spiraling knotwork, and jewel-toned evangelist portraits represent the summit of a tradition now under existential threat. The round towers that rise across the Irish landscape in this era tell the story in stone. Narrow-doored, tapering cylinders reaching 100 feet into the sky, they serve as bell towers, treasuries, and last refuges. Their doors sit 10 or 12 feet above ground level, accessible only by ladders that can be pulled up when raiders approach. Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, Monaster Bois, each great monastic site builds one. They are monuments to a civilization that refuses to abandon its sacred places, but acknowledges the new reality of violence. Yet the Norse do not merely raid. By 841, they establish a permanent long fort, a fortified ship camp, at Dublin, on the dark pool where the River Poddle meets the Liffey. Within decades, similar settlements appear at Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. These long forts evolve into the first true towns in Irish history. Dublin becomes a hub of slave trading, silver exchange, and craft production. Excavations at Wood Quay reveal layers of Norse urban life: timber houses, bone combs, amber beads, leather shoes, and coins minted locally. The Norse bring urbanization to a society that has organized itself around dispersed ring forts and monastic enclosures for centuries. In Scotland, Norse settlement is even more transformative. The Orkney and Shetland Islands become fully Norse territories, governed by jarls owing allegiance to Norwegian kings. The Hebrides fall under Norse control. The kingdom of Dalriata fragments. Pictish and Gaelic peoples consolidate under Kenneth MacAlpin around 843, forming the Kingdom of Alba, a defensive fusion driven partly by the shared Norse threat. The very shape of Scotland emerges from this crucible. Welsh kingdoms face pressure from two directions. Norse raiders strike the coasts while the expanding English kingdom of Wessex presses from the east. Rhodri Mor of Gwynedd fights both, killing a Viking leader in battle in 856, but the Welsh kingdoms remain fragmented and vulnerable. In Ireland, the political landscape shifts decisively in the 10th century. The Dalcase dynasty of Munster, led by Brian Boru, rises from regional obscurity to challenge the traditional dominance of the Uí Níl High Kings. Brian defeats the Norse of Limerick, subjugates rival Irish kingdoms, and by 1002 claims the High Kingship of Ireland, the first ruler from outside the Uí Níl to do so. He imposes tribute, repairs monasteries, and commissions manuscript production, presenting himself as a Christian emperor of the Irish. On the 23rd of April, 1014, the forces of Brian Boru meet a coalition of Norse Dublin, the Kingdom of Leinster, and Viking allies from Orkney and the Isle of Man at Clontarf, north of Dublin. The battle rages from dawn until evening. Brian's forces prevail, shattering Norse military power in Ireland permanently. But Brian himself is killed in his tent, struck down by fleeing Norse warriors. His victory ensures that Ireland will not become a Scandinavian colony. His death ensures that no successor can hold the fragile unity he forged. The High Kingship fractures again into competing provincial claims, and the island enters a century of contested sovereignty that will leave it vulnerable to an entirely different invader arriving from across the Irish Sea. That invader comes not from Scandinavia but from the feudal heartland of northern France. The century and a half after Clontarf sees Ireland's provincial kings, the O'Briens of Thomond, the O'Connors of Connaught, the MacLaughlins of the north, locked in ceaseless competition for a high kingship that carries prestige but never consolidates real authority. It is this very fragmentation that opens the door. In 1166, Diarmait mac Murchada, the deposed king of Leinster, crosses to England and then to Aquitaine, seeking the aid of Henry II of England. Henry grants permission for his Norman Welsh barons to intervene. In 1169, the first contingent of mail-clad knights and Welsh archers lands at Bannow Bay in Wexford. Their leader, Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, arrives the following year with a larger force, takes Waterford, marries Diarmait's daughter Eoif, and inherits the Leinster kingship upon Diarmait's death. By 1171, Henry himself crosses to Ireland with a massive army, accepting the submission of most Irish kings and establishing English lordship over the island. The Norman impact is immediate and architectural. Stone castles rise across the eastern and southern lowlands, tower houses and mottes replacing the earthen raths and timber halls of Gaelic lords. Towns are chartered under English law. Dublin, already a Norse-Irish city, becomes the seat of English administration. Yet the conquest is incomplete. Beyond the fertile plains of Leinster and Munster, the boglands, forests and mountains of Connaught and Ulster remain under Gaelic control. The boundary between English and Gaelic Ireland, later formalised as the Pale, is porous. Norman settlers intermarry with Irish families, adopt the Irish language, patronise Gaelic poets, and within 2 generations become, in the famous phrase, more Irish than the Irish themselves. The Statutes of Kilkenny, enacted in 1366, attempt to reverse this cultural absorption, forbidding English settlers from speaking Irish, wearing Irish dress, or marrying Irish partners. The very need for such legislation reveals how powerfully Gaelic culture resists displacement. Across the Irish Sea, Wales faces a more systematic subjugation. The native Welsh princes, particularly Llywelyn ap Gruffydd of Gwynedd, achieve a brief zenith of power under the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267, which recognises Llywelyn as Prince of Wales. But Edward I of England, determined to impose direct royal authority, launches 2 devastating campaigns in 1277 and 1282–83. Llywelyn is killed in a skirmish near Builth Wells in December 1282. His brother Dafydd is captured and executed the following year. The Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284 imposes English law and administration on Wales. Edward constructs an iron ring of enormous concentric castles, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris, designed not merely as fortifications but as symbols of permanent dominion. Their pale limestone walls still stand against the green Welsh hills, monuments to conquest. Yet Welsh language, poetry, and lore survive beneath the castle shadows. The bardic tradition continues in noble households, preserving genealogies and prophecies of a coming deliverer. Scotland alone among the Celtic-influenced kingdoms maintains its independence. When Edward I attempts to impose overlordship after the Scottish succession crisis of 1290, resistance erupts under William Wallace and then Robert the Bruce. Bruce's decisive victory at Bannockburn in June 1314 secures Scottish sovereignty. The Declaration of Arbroath in 1320 thus, addressed to the Pope, articulates a vision of national freedom that resonates across centuries. Scotland remains an independent kingdom, its Gaelic-speaking Highlands preserving clan structures, oral poetry, and social customs that trace unbroken lines to the Iron Age world. In the Highlands and Western Isles, the Book of the Dean of Lismore, compiled in the early 1500s, gathers Gaelic verse spanning centuries, proof that the literary tradition endures despite every pressure. Across all these lands, the Celtic world bends under feudal weight but does not break. Its languages retreat to mountains, islands, and the margins of kingdoms, yet they carry forward a civilization that refuses extinction. The margins hold, but the centre is closing in. By the early 1500s, the Tudor dynasty turns its full administrative and military weight toward the last Celtic territories that have resisted English absorption. In Ireland, the Gaelic lordships beyond the Pale, the great houses of O'Neill, O'Donnell, Maguire, and O'Brien, still govern by Brehon law, still patronise bards, still raise armies through ancient obligations of kinship and clientship. But Henry VIII's declaration as King of Ireland in 1541 signals a new intent. Surrender and re-grant policies demand that Gaelic chiefs abandon their titles, adopt English law, and receive their lands back as feudal grants from the crown. Some comply, many resist. The resistance culminates in the 9 Years' War, fought from 1594 to 1603 across the rain-soaked drumlin country of Ulster. Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, and Red Hugh O'Donnell forge an unprecedented alliance of Gaelic lords, winning a stunning victory at the Yellow Ford in 1598. Spanish troops land at Kinsale in 1601 to support the Irish cause, but the Battle of Kinsale ends in catastrophic defeat. O'Neill submits. In September of 1607, he and Rory O'Donnell and nearly 100 Gaelic nobles sail from Rathmullen on Lough Swilly, bound for the continent. The flight of the Earls empties Ulster of its aristocratic leadership in a single voyage. Tower houses stand vacant. Bardic schools lose their patrons. The old order collapses not through cultural erosion, but through political decapitation. Into the emptied lands come settlers. The plantation of Ulster, formally organized from 1610 onward, transplants tens of thousands of English and Scottish Protestants onto confiscated Gaelic estates. New towns rise, Londonderry, Coleraine, Enniskillen, built on grid plans with market squares and defensive walls, replacing the dispersed settlement patterns of Gaelic society. The Irish-speaking Catholic population is pushed onto marginal land. A demographic and cultural transformation begins that will define the province for centuries. Worse follows. Oliver Cromwell lands at Dublin in August of 1649 with a veteran army of 12,000. His siege of Drogheda in September ends in massacre. The garrison and hundreds of civilians are put to the sword. Wexford suffers a similar fate weeks later. The Cromwellian settlement that follows confiscates vast tracts of Irish land, transplanting Catholic landowners west of the Shannon. By 1660, Catholic ownership of Irish land has fallen from roughly 60% to barely 8%. The Gaelic literary class, dependent on aristocratic patronage, scatters. Poets compose laments in a language increasingly confined to the poor. Across the Irish Sea, Wales undergoes a quieter but no less consequential transformation. The laws in Wales. Acts of 1535 and 1542 impose English as the sole language of courts and administration. Welsh-speaking gentry adopt English to access power. Yet the language survives among the common people, sustained by the translation of the Bible into Welsh by William Morgan in 1588, a text that anchors Welsh literacy for generations. In Brittany, French royal centralization steadily erodes Breton legal and linguistic autonomy. The union of Brittany with France, formalized in 1532, begins a long process of administrative absorption that marginalizes the Breton language in official life. Scotland's reckoning comes last and most violently. The Jacobite cause, loyalty to the exiled Stuart dynasty, draws its deepest support from the Gaelic-speaking Highland clans. Risings in 1689, 1715, and 1745 each end in defeat. The final catastrophe falls on Culloden Moor on the 16th of April, 1746. The Duke of Cumberland's artillery and disciplined volleys shatter the Highland charge in under an hour. What follows is not merely military defeat, but cultural annihilation by statute. The Disarming Act strips Highlanders of weapons. The Dress Act bans tartan and the kilt. Heritable jurisdictions are abolished, destroying the legal basis of clan authority. Within a generation, the clearances begin, landlords evicting thousands of Gaelic-speaking tenants to make way for sheep, burning roof timbers to prevent return. Glens that held families for centuries empty into silence. The smoke of burn and thatch drifts across landscapes where cattle once grazed and pipers once played. From Ireland to Scotland, from Wales to Brittany, the Celtic-speaking world enters its darkest century, its political structures dismantled, its languages driven from public life, its people scattered across oceans. Yet in cottages, in chapels, in the memories of the displaced, the words persist. The words persist, and from persistence, something unexpected begins to grow. In the 1760s, a young Scotsman named James Macpherson publishes what he claims are translations of an ancient Gaelic poet called Ossian, a bard of the 3rd century whose verses sing of mist-shrouded heroes, lost kingdoms, and the aching beauty of the Highland landscape. The poems are largely Macpherson's own invention, woven from genuine fragments of oral tradition, but their effect is seismic. Across Europe, readers devour Ossian. Napoleon carries a copy on campaign. Goethe weeps over its pages. The Celtic world, so recently crushed and cleared, suddenly becomes an object of longing and admiration. What empires tried to silence, Romanticism begins to resurrect. In Wales, the revival takes a different form, rooted not in literary forgery, but in genuine cultural continuity. The Eisteddfod, an ancient tradition of competitive poetry and music dating to at least the 12th century, is formally revived in 1789 at Corwen. By the 1800s, the national Eisteddfod becomes the central institution of Welsh cultural identity, drawing thousands to annual gatherings where bards compete in strict metre poetry, choirs perform in Welsh, and the language itself is celebrated as a living instrument of thought. Chapel culture reinforces this. Nonconformist congregations across Wales conduct services, hymns, and Sunday schools entirely in Welsh, creating a parallel world where the language thrives despite English institutional dominance. The movement Cymru Fyd, founded in 1886, channels cultural pride into political aspiration. In Ireland, the revival burns with a fiercer urgency. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 has devastated the Irish-speaking West. 1 million dead, another million emigrated, and the Gaelic-speaking population halved in a generation. The language retreats to the western seaboard. Yet from this catastrophe, a determination crystallizes. The Gaelic Athletic Association, founded in 1884, reclaims Irish sports, hurling Gaelic football as expressions of national identity. The Gaelic League, established in 1893 by Douglas Hyde, launches a campaign to restore Irish as a spoken language, organizing classes, publishing textbooks, and insisting that Ireland's soul cannot survive in English alone. Simultaneously, the Irish literary renaissance transforms Dublin into a crucible of cultural nationalism. William Butler Yeats draws on Celtic mythology to create a poetry of haunting power. Lady Augusta Gregory collects folklore from Connaught cottages. John Millington Synge finds in the Aran Islands a world where Gaelic rhythms still shape English speech. Political nationalism accelerates alongside cultural revival. Young Ireland's failed rising of 1848 gives way to the Fenian movement of the 1860s. Charles Stewart Parnell's parliamentary campaign for Home Rule dominates the 1880s before fracturing. Arthur Griffith found Sinn Féin in 1905. The Irish Republican Brotherhood plans in secret. On the 24th of April, 1916, rebels seize the General Post Office in Dublin and proclaim an Irish Republic. The Easter Rising lasts 6 days before British artillery reduces much of central Dublin to rubble. The executions that follow, 15 leaders shot over 9 days in May, transform public opinion. What had been a minority insurrection becomes a national cause. In Scotland, Highland societies preserve Gaelic song and tradition, while the crofting movement of the 1880s wins land reform. In Brittany, the regionalist journal Fées Habrés promotes Breton language and Catholic identity against Parisian centralization. Across the Celtic fringe, suppressed peoples find voice. The War of Independence follows in Ireland from 1919 to 1921. Guerrilla warfare, ambushes, reprisals, burning creameries, and midnight raids. The Anglo-Irish Treaty of the 6th of December, 1921, partitions the island and establishes the Irish Free State. On the 6th of December, 1922, that state comes into formal existence. For the first time since the flight of the Earls 3 centuries earlier, a Celtic-speaking nation governs itself. The achievement is partial, contested, scarred by civil war. But it is real. A language nearly extinguished, a culture nearly erased, a people nearly scattered beyond recall, have built a state from the fragments that survived. The new state writes Irish into its constitution as the national and first official language. Road signs appear in Gaelic script. Schools in the Gaeltacht regions of Connemara, the Aran Islands, West Kerry, and Donegal teach through Irish. The civil service requires proficiency. Yet the reality beneath the symbolism proves stubborn. English remains the language of commerce, emigration, media, and daily life for the vast majority. The Gaeltacht, those scattered western districts where Irish survives as a community language, shrinks decade by decade. In 1926, roughly 250,000 people live in officially designated Gaeltacht areas. By the turn of the 21st century, linguists estimate that only 20,000 use Irish as a true first language of the home. The state has preserved the language in law, but struggles to preserve it on the tongue. Yet something shifts in the late 20th century. In 1996, Tailefis na Gaeilge, later renamed TG4, begins broadcasting from Baile na Habhan in Connemara. Irish-language television reaches living rooms across the island, carrying drama, sport, news, and children's programming. Gaelscoileanna, Irish medium schools outside the Gaeltacht, multiply in Dublin, Cork, and Belfast. By 2020, over 50,000 children attend Irish medium education. The language finds new speakers not through obligation, but through choice. Across the Irish Sea, Welsh traces an even more remarkable trajectory. In 1962, Saunders Lewis delivers a radio lecture titled The Fate of the Language, warning that Welsh faces extinction within a generation without political action. The response is immediate. Cymdeithas Were Iaith Gymraeg, the Welsh Language Society, campaigns through civil disobedience for bilingual road signs, official forms, and broadcasting. The Welsh Language Act of 1967 grants limited legal status. In 1982, S4C begins broadcasting as a dedicated Welsh language television channel, the product of a hunger strike threat by Gwynfor Evans. The Welsh Language Act of 1993 establishes the principle that Welsh and English hold equal standing in public life. Welsh medium schools expand across South Wales, where the language had retreated furthest. By 2021, the census records nearly 900,000 Welsh speakers, nearly 30% of the population. Scotland's path differs. Scottish Gaelic, once spoken across the Highlands and Islands, contracts to fewer than 60,000 speakers by the late 20th century. The Gaelic Language Act of 2005 establishes Bord na Gaedhlig to promote the language, and Gaelic medium education grows slowly in cities like Glasgow and Edinburgh. The Scottish Parliament, reconvened in 1999 after nearly 3 centuries, provides a political framework within which Gaelic identity finds institutional support. Devolution does not restore the language to daily dominance, but it creates space for survival. In Cornwall, the story borders on the miraculous. Cornish effectively ceases as a community language by the late 18th century. Yet in 1904, Henry Jenner publishes a handbook of Cornish, and through the 20th century, small groups of enthusiasts reconstruct the language from medieval texts. By 2010, UNESCO reclassifies Cornish from extinct to critically endangered, an acknowledgement that speakers exist again. In Brittany, Breton faces the centralized linguistic policy of the French state. The Deixon Law of 1951 permits limited regional language teaching, but Breton speakers decline from over 1 million at mid-century to roughly 200,000 by 2020. The Diwan Immersion Schools, founded in 1977, educate several thousand children entirely through Breton, sustaining a fragile but living tradition. The Inter-Celtic Festival at Lorient, founded in 1971, draws hundreds of thousands each August to celebrate the music, dance, and languages of all 6 Celtic nations. Celtic music, from the chieftains to Alan Stivell to Runrig, carries ancient melodic traditions into global consciousness. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998, bringing peace to Northern Ireland, also affirms respect for linguistic diversity on the island. Today, approximately 1.2 million people speak a Celtic language. Road signs in 6 Celtic tongues mark territories from Waterford to Quimper, from Caernarfon to Inverness. The thread is thin. It has been thin for centuries, but it holds, woven through school classrooms and television studios, festival stages and kitchen tables, carrying forward a linguistic and cultural inheritance that first took shape in the river valleys of Bronze Age Europe more than 3,000 years ago. Thank you for joining this journey through the long arc of Celtic civilization. If these stories have moved or informed you, consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss a new exploration of the worlds that shaped our own.